Hi everyone, my name's Jessica Lewis and I'm a third-year graduate student in the neuroscience program. Today I'll be talking about my work in Dr. Crystal Parker's lab, looking at the role of the cerebellum in bipolar disorder. So the first question that we'll need to tackle is, what does the cerebellum do? Traditionally, we're taught that the cerebellum is involved in motor functions such as coordination, balance, and postural control. These functions are typically associated with the anterior lobe of the cerebellum. Additionally, the cerebellum is involved in non-motor functions associated with the posterior lobe. These functions include emotional regulation, language, working memory, attention, and social cognition. One important area of the posterior lobe is the vermis, which is the midline region and what we'll be focused on today because it's important for things like emotional regulation. In studying different psychiatric disorders, we've also found that the cerebellum is abnormal in disorders like schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorder, and bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder affects 1.6% of the population, and patients with bipolar disorder often show abnormalities in brain areas associated with emotional regulation and reward, including the cerebellum. Specifically, the cerebellar vermis has connections to the limbic system, which implicates it in a role of emotional processing. Bipolar disorder patients have abnormalities in this area, such as decreased vermal volume compared to controls. And what we find is that as vermal volume decreases, the severity of bipolar symptoms increases. Currently, we have an ongoing study looking at the role of the cerebellum in bipolar disorder, and we are applying cerebellar transcranial magnetic stimulation to try to help these patients normalize brain activity. During this study, we found a small subgroup of bipolar patients that have cysts in the region of the cerebellum. So what this looks like is the cerebellum is housed in the posterior fossa of the skull, and in this area, a cyst can grow and push in on the cerebellum, and it affects its structure and development. So our case series consists of 5 bipolar patients out of 71 that have cysts and 1 healthy control. And what we wanted to look at in these patients is what region of the cerebellum was most impacted by these cysts. And we hypothesized that these cysts would localize in the area of the cerebellar vermis, which would be consistent with previous findings in studies of bipolar disorder, as well as what we functionally think the cerebellar vermis is doing in terms of emotional regulation. And so what we did was we traced all of the cysts, and then we created a cyst overlay, which combines all of the cysts into one and shows where the most overlap of the cysts is and where the least overlap is. And what we saw was in red that the most overlap occurred in the area of the cerebellar vermis, which is what we expected, and is consistent with its role in emotional regulation. So future directions will involve further study of these patients on specifically cerebellar-driven tasks, such as interval timing and idling conditioning, and also collecting data on cognitive functions using the NIH toolbox. And with that, I'd like to thank my lab. I'd like to specifically thank my mentor, Dr. Parker, as well as my main collaborator on this project, Victoria Muller-Ewald, as well as the many collaborators I've gotten the chance to work with on this project. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.